as you'll see, one of the nice things about repetitious behavior is that it's predictable. Okay, and I'm going to use that in my therapy to help that client recognize that what they think is spontaneous behavior is actually very predictable. Okay, and you're going to see the way that I frame it in my mind is that it's really an orbit. An orbit, when you look into, in terms of astronomy, if you look at the movement of the planets, you'll see that they're in an orbit, a predictable orbit of behavior. So the point here being is that orbit's gravity phenomena is the theoretical basis of the hard sciences. My question is it possible to use the science of the solar system as a metaphor for the human personality system? Okay. So in terms of the human personality system, gravity is basically what keeps the system intact, and that would equal attachment. Okay. Orbits basically equal repetitive energy, right? So whether that repetitive energy can be behavior, it can be thoughts, it can be emotions. So as we see when we work with our clients, that very often they're doing repetitive energy in the form of behavior, thoughts, and emotions. In terms of the orbit gravity system, it functions as a whole unit. And in a similar way, the personality system is within that person a whole unit. They work, that individual is a unit. Okay. As I mentioned before, it turns out that the sun has 99.85 of all, basically the gravity in the solar system. That's kind of interesting. All right. We're going to see why that's 99.85, that's a lot, All right. All right, so how does that translate into what we're talking about here? Okay, it means that the gravity of the system is the dominant force of what's happening. Okay, in terms of early childhood, so attachment is the gravity, right? And that is going to affect the personality of the child, the amount of attention or amount of connection that child feels with mother, father, and their family, that they feel connected. So, that's kind of interesting. So what would you say would be the percentage of what's the importance of percentage in terms of the maturing personality? What might you say? What would you think? 99.8. Yeah, okay, that's what I think. Really. But in your mind you might think, well, maybe it's like 50%, maybe it's 60%, 70%. 80% at most, right? But at least when I was kind of doing the research here, and I said that the 99.85, whoa, wait a minute here. So what that tells me is that if I'm doing treatment and I'm creating an alliance with that client, that's 99.85 of what I need to do. Okay? All right? That's kind of a wild thought because, attachment is important. Yeah, all right, okay. But, if it's that important, and that means that's all I have to do in treatment, is just do the attachment thing, okay? And it doesn't mean, I think that people think attachment is like, okay, I'm going to be nice and huggy, and pat on the back. That doesn't necessarily have to be attachment. The attachment means that the client feels seen, that the client feels that they're being witnessed, okay? And as you'll see in the video, some of the things that I say to the clients are off the wall. You think, oh no, don't say that, But part of creating the attachment is to say things that the client expects to hear, okay? And we'll see that in the video.
Okay.
Yeah.
What you're talking about really is attachment as a process, not attachment as an event, because there's different.
For sure.
Okay.
For sure, attachment is a process, okay? But in coming back to attachment, that's creating trust, between yourself and that client. And as you can imagine, and as we see actually with the clients that we work with, one of their main problems is that they don't trust anybody. Okay, and if you realize that as they were growing up, they couldn't trust their mother. If their mother was alcoholic or a drug addict, they couldn't trust their mother. You know, their father was never home, so they learned that in the world you cannot trust anybody. We kind of come along and we go, hey, you can trust me, it's all right, you know, I'm here for you. They have no idea what you're talking about, all right, because that doesn't match their world. It doesn't match what they've grown up with, okay?
Do you sort of delineate or deconstruct attachment in terms of really, because we use attachment a lot, and I find that sometimes it loses its meaning to me because I'm not sure what people mean
Right.
when they say attachment. So do you clearly define, in terms of the importance of the concept of attachment in this, what exactly it is attachment means to this?
I'm hoping to. It's kind of like a vague concept. I know what you're saying. I know, because in my mind, I'm constantly trying to, define exactly what attachment is. But part of it is being a witness to the client. It's obviously being connected, bonded with that client, creating that connection, creating that bond. But as you'll see, what's interesting about attachment is that I can say absurd things to the client, and as long as I'm attaching, then we're good. Then that helps the therapy. You know, and what I'm saying is kind of like nutty. You know, like, why would you say that? You know, but because it helps the attachment, then that helps the therapy move forward. Okay, so we'll talk more about that. Okay. So as I mentioned before, if we're talking about the attachment, then that refers to the fact that in terms of the therapeutic alliance, that in my mind, that represents 99.85 of what we need to accomplish. Okay. So the question is, what do all these things have in common? Addictions, mental health disorders, repetitive criminal behavior, and family conflict. What might you say they have in common? If you were to graph them, what would the graph look like? Say what?
Patterns.
Okay, what would the pattern look like?
Circle.
Yeah, absolutely. So the pattern of what we're looking at with each of these things would look something like that. Okay? And basically, in terms of their behavior, each of those things does this. Okay? It goes around. Okay? And it's repetitive. And they do that behavior again and again and again. Now, if you're lucky and you're working with a client, they have one of those. All right, they have one problem. They have an addiction. They have a mental health problem. They have a repetitive behavior, criminal behavior. They have just family issues, right? That's if you're lucky, all right? So if you're lucky, it's going to look something like this. All right? This is what you'd be working on. And that's not really very complicated because we can work on that one thing, all right? The problem is, or when we start getting more into what the problem might be, is that there might be double trouble, right? That not only do they have a mental disorder, they have an addiction along with their mental disorder. So now we got two things going on, right? All right, so now we're kind of trying to deal with both of these things going on at the same time. Now, if you're really not so lucky anymore, now you got triple trouble, right? And in the triple trouble, you might have, you got family problems now, right? So now they have their mental health problem. They have their addiction, and along with that is there's family issues going on, all right? And again, that is also a repetitive event that's happening. So now we got these three things going on, all right? And as you might imagine, and then when they're really looking for trouble, okay, then we can throw in the criminal behavior, all right? And this is kind of what we're looking at. And you can get a sense as a clinician, you're trying to juggle all these balls, like, trying to keep track, right? And I guess, the question is, what do we work on? What should we focus on? Where do we start? And what's the most important here? How do we define what's the most important here? Okay? So that's why we need to define the concept of change and what does change look like. Okay? So, as I said, we're going to use the solar system model. All right? And okay, so this is kind of what the solar system looks like. All right. And in this thought experiment, let's say we want to change the orbit of Venus. All right. So in our mind, we're going to think, all right, how Venus is having a problem, we need to change Venus. And again, an issue here is that obviously Venus is a moving target, right? So how are we going to change Venus? All right, if we're just going to focus on Venus, well, we might push, pull, threaten. Well, you better change or else. All right, we're going to try to explain why they should change. We're going to try to convince them. Maybe we'll give them a reward. We're going to say, please change, please, please, please. And if that doesn't work, maybe so, pretty please, right? Maybe that'll work, okay. Or what's another way that we might change that orbit?
Change the gravitational pull?
You got it. All right. If we change the gravitational, the gravitation of that system, okay, if we alter the gravity of the sun, okay, then what happens is that orbit will stretch and move, okay, and shift. Okay. So before we started out with a more rigid orbit, okay. And if we shift the gravity, if we shift the attachment of the sun, we're going to boost the gravity and the orbit of Venus. What's interesting about this, the orbit will spontaneously shift. Okay? Now that's kind of an interesting concept there, right? Maybe spontaneously. I mean, you got to tell them to change, you got to convince them to change. And no. If you can get across that you're connected with that client, if you get into their life, and you become part of their life without explaining that I'm in your life, I'm just there. Okay? If you can create that alliance, that will influence spontaneous change in the client. Okay? So that's kind of an interesting concept there, because the assumption is, well, we're going to have to give him a reward. Here's a reward to make a change, and we're going to explain to you how to change. We're going to try to influence that change in a certain way. But this is a way to kind of view a way of spontaneous change occurring, okay? So this is a visual illustration of shifting repetitive behavior or energy, okay? And what's interesting about this also, it moves more toward a scientific view of what we're trying to, of psychology and what we're doing in therapy. And what's nice about this kind of change, it's actually not only spontaneous, it's actually rapid, it's exponential. Okay, usually in therapy we think that it's got to be a certain way. It's like, it's okay. Change has got to be like 2 steps every day, a little bit every day. Okay, and what we see in this kind of shift is that it can actually be exponential growth. And again, what's nice about this is that I'm not telling the client to change. The client changes of their own free will. Okay. Now, in terms of looking at the entire system, so we shifted Venus, right? And my focus was on Venus. But now let's take a look at what was happening to the rest of the system as I'm just focusing on Venus, right? And what happens is something like this. All right. So as Venus shifts, it means that the whole system has to move. Okay. So change occurs to the entire system. And basically, the initial state the client was in had a sense of equilibrium, even in their rigid state. And now, with the shift of attachment, with the shift of gravity, there's an equilibrium that occurs in that personality system. But you can see what happens is that there's more flexibility in that personality system. Okay. Here we go. All right, so we're going to see a video. Did anybody see the video on YouTube at all? Nobody? Okay, not a problem. Okay, then you're in for a. That's even better because now I get your like initial reactions, without, like, oh, okay, all right. So before we do that, any questions? Any questions? Any comments? Yeah.
So one of the underlying assumptions is that the change is going to be positive change. Does it change?
Well, yeah, and actually, what this alludes to is that if you do something that hurts the attachment, okay, it turns out that basically our clients have been so traumatized already that there's really not much you can do that's going to traumatize them more. I mean, unless you really abuse them, in a really inappropriate way. But, I mean, the worst that can happen generally in treatment is that you don't create the attachment, so there's no movement, okay? So I'm saying if your focus as the clinician is to move toward a stronger alliance with the client, then there will be positive change. Okay, any other questions? Okay, all right, so here we go.